Some chess openings are completely inoffensive. I mean, you wouldn't break into a cold sweat if your opponent ventured, let's say, the close Sicilian, or maybe the exchange Slav, or even one b3. No, these aren't openings to send shivers down the spine. Other openings need parental consent before Johnny the Obnoxious Jr. is allowed to touch them. For instance, no self-respecting budding Kasparov will be allowed to venture the King's Indian, the Benko Gambit, or the highly analysed 2c3 Sicilian without mummy's consent. Other openings need maniacs in order to play them. Ask mad, bad and dangerous Mike Basman about that, with his grobs and his orangutans, and maybe even his Durkin. But like me, if you want another class of opening altogether, then you've come to the right place, because we're in for some really adult entertainment. If there were ever a chess opening which could be designated as X-rated, then the Albin counter gambit would fit the bill. White plays d4, black d5, white plays c4, and no doubt he's looking forward to a nice steady Queen's Gambit game. Then comes e5, a very violent idea, where black tries to wrest the initiative from white at the very start of the game. The good thing about the Albin, as we'll see, is that it's a gambit which white must accept if he wants to get any advantage. D takes e5 is the normal move. And on this video, I'll be looking at lines where black plays the early advance of the pawn, d4, putting a wedge into white's position. We must see the famous trap, the famous Albin trap with which many players have been caught out. And that occurs after d takes e5, d4, and white plays the immediate e3 here, trying desperately to get rid of black's strong pawn on d4. But actually e3 is a losing mistake. No doubt a lot of you know what to do, but bishop b4 check completely refutes what looks like an obvious move, with three separate comical lines. The first line sees white blocking with the knight. Now that looks halfway decent, but the easiest way to bust this line is d takes e3, that's the idea, just completely laming white's pawn structure. F takes e3, queen h4 check, g3, queen e4, hitting the pawn on e5, hitting the pawn on e3, hitting that poor old rook on h1, and forcing queen f3. Well, we continue with simple moves. Queen takes c5, no need to be fancy against this line. a3, well, I'm suggesting that, I don't really know what to do. I mean, white's position's very bad already. Bishop takes d2 check, very simple. And now king takes d2, because if bishop takes d2, b2 is hanging. So king takes d2, and then simplest is knight c6, with the idea of bishop f5 and castles on the queen side. White has a disgusting position. Now on to the no less plausible, in my view, king e2. I mean, if white can make the move e3 or move 4, he can certainly play the move king e2. And then the books give knight c6, e takes d4, knight takes d4, king e3, bishop c5. When I guess white's best move is king e4, and not many people have had the courage to play it. Finally, bishop d2, but now comes the crushing move d takes e3, with two separate lines. The trap, the famous Albin trap, occurs after bishop takes b4, e takes f2, check, king e2, otherwise white loses that queen on d1, and then f takes g1 equals knight is quite a strong move in this position, winning. If after d takes e3, queen a4 check, then the simplest is knight c6. With the idea, bishop takes b4, e takes f2 check, king takes f2, queen h4 check, g3. Incidentally, just putting that move back, if king e3, then queen d4 check, king f3, bishop g4 check, king g3, knight h6 is curtains. So after queen h4 check, g3, but then queen d4 check, king g2, queen takes b2 check, knight d2, and then in Petrov versus Panteleiev, Bulgaria 1973, the conclusion was simply queen takes rook on a1, knight gf3, queen b2, a3, bishop g4. White resigns. We can consider the basic position: d4, d5, c4, e5, d takes e5, d4, knight f3, knight c6. And I'll be considering three moves for white here, the three most popular moves. The first of which is 5a3. Now this is quite an interesting try by white, because not only does he take away the b4 square from black's pieces, for instance he stops a move like bishop b4 check, or knight b4 at any stage, but he also threatens to maybe round up black's d-pawn, with perhaps ideas like b4, bishop b2, and then maybe knight coming round to b3, after which black's d-pawn begins to look decidedly shaky. Black cannot give white the time to execute these plans. Accordingly, I'm going to argue that the best move for black here is f6, a gambit which I believe gives black good play. And actually it's quite a logical idea, because white has made a slightly slow move on the side of the board, so black hits back in the centre straight away. And this is also a gambit which is completely forcing. White must accept this pawn if he wants to retain any sort of advantage. So e takes f6 is the normal move, and now I recommend queen takes f6. Now actually this whole gambit is an idea of a Norwegian international master, Rojan, who used it a lot in the 1940s and 1950s, and it's been completely forgotten about. I believe, with the help of recent improvements, some of which are by myself, that it gives black reasonable play for the pawn. Now white has several moves worth considering. The first move I'm going to consider is the move bishop g5, which is not one of white's better moves, yet it has been played. And we're now going to follow the game Tataev versus Naglis, USSR 1964. After bishop g5, black played queen g6, and white played in this position bishop f4. Now the argument was that black's queen has been deflected to a slightly less effective square than f6. But black was happy once again to move the queen, because after queen f7, both the bishop on f4 and the pawn at c4 are under attack. The net effect of bishop g5 is that rather than gaining time, white is actually seemingly losing time, because if we put the bishop back on g5 and the queen on g6, you'll see that the move h6 is a key part of black's plan anyway, and if white didn't play bishop f4, then it will come with gain of tempo. We'll see why in a moment. So just dropping this back, bishop f4. In the game, Naglis played queen f7, and the bishop went back to g3. And now black got on with rapid development. Bishop came out to g4, hitting the knight. White played knight bd2, and black castled on the queen side. It's difficult for black to get by without this move in this variation. White played b4. Now the problem for white is it's difficult to develop the king side. That is the precise nature of white's difficulty here. It's okay for him to start pushing pawns on the queen side, but what about this poor king on e1? Perhaps that's the drawback of this whole line. So black just developed sensibly with knight f6, preparing perhaps a bishop move from f8, let's say to d6 or maybe to e7, and the rook swinging to e8 with tremendous pressure down the central files. And after knight f6, white ploughed on with b5. Knight a5 was played. And white played knight e5, hoping to fork the queen and the bishop and thereby gain time. But the problem is, white is moving pieces which he's developed already, so he's not doing very much about the poor undeveloped state of his king side. Queen a4 was played, b6, and white played f3. Then came bishop f5 and knight b3. Well, it looks like this is a terrible mistake, but white thought that he'd seen a tactic, because after bishop c2, white played knight c5. Bit of a crazy game this. Queen f5 happened, and now white's idea was to play e4. But it simply doesn't work. D takes e3, bishop d3, queen takes d3, knight c takes d3, bishop takes a4, knight b2, bishop went to b3, and the knight came into f7, forking black's rooks. Black went rook d2, knight takes h8, rook takes b2, castles, and then bishop takes c4. White resigned. Well, summing up the position, here black has already got two pieces for a rook. It's unlikely that the knight on h8 is coming out alive, and I think the winning plan is simply bishop c5 followed by a quick e2. Not only does white have to deal with all of those threats, but to add insult to injury, the rook on f1 is on prise. So black's position is quite strong enough for white to just pack it in. I think it's very unlikely you're going to be seeing this bishop g5 move too often. Just helps black along the line to do what he wants to do. And it's much more likely that white is going to play either g3 or the move I consider now, knight b d2 in this position. These are typical Albin moves. In this case, maybe knight e4 enters the equation one day, and there are also the possibilities I mentioned earlier about rounding up black's d-pawn. Essentially white's posing a question to black. Well, what are you going to do about your d-pawn, chum? Alright, well, black's development must be continue to be pointed, and therefore Rojan hit upon bishop f5 in this position. And the only move to have been played very often here is g3. Black castles on the queen side. And now there are two lines for white. I think the move you're going to face most often is bishop g2. I mean, that's the obvious move, isn't it? And now I'm going to recommend d3. This tends to nip white's play in the bud because it hits him before he gets castled, for one thing. In the second place, it takes away the possibility of b4 for a little while. And in fact, this was Rudolf Spielmann, one of the great masters of the Gambit, his favourite in this particular position. Now, there's very little theory on this position, but in the old games which I've unearthed, white almost always played e3. And the reason for this is that castles, which is the natural move, is prohibited in view of d takes e2, queen takes e2, bishop d3, when I think black immediately gets the better position. So returning now to e3, I think black should play g5 against that, with two known games. In both cases, white tries to unravel the blockage on his queen side. In the game Hardikse Szabo, Hungary 1967, white played rook b1, intending b4 and bishop b2. And black played bishop g7. Then came b4. And actually, after queen e7, as played by Szabo, black quickly obtained the worst position when white played bishop b2. But I'm going to recommend an improvement here. I recommend knight ge7, just continuing with development here, with the idea that after bishop b2, black simply plays queen g6. For instance, the following line can occur. Bishop takes g7, queen takes g7, white castles, and now I think h5 is an excellent move, when black has full development and a clear attack on the king side for his pawn. Note how strong this pawn at d3 is. It really ties white up in this position. I consider black has full compensation for the material sacrificed here. And the second move after g5 to have been played was rook a2. Very unnatural move, as played in the game Post versus Spielmann, Berlin 1907. Then came h5, attacking on the king side, b4, bishop g7, bishop b2. I suppose black could consider queen g6, as in the last example. But Spielmann played queen e7, and the game got very murky. b5 by white, knight a5, bishop takes g7, queen takes g7, queen a1, knight f6, and black had the initiative. He went on to win this game in 31 moves. Returning to the position where black has just castled on the queen side, I mentioned that I thought bishop g2 was the obvious developing move. Well, in the game Pedersen-Rojan Correspondence 1931-2, white tried the funny move knight h4. But this attempt to attack the bishop should really cost too much time, and indeed in the game black quickly built up a winning position. Black played bishop g4. He wasn't going to allow white to take the bishop, obviously. And white played f3. I suppose he thought he could get away with anything in correspondence chess. But then came a nice surprise, bishop e7. And the neat idea is that if f takes g4, then queen takes h4, and white can't recapture. With unlimited time to consider the position, white saw the threat and played knight e4. Black played queen e6. Knight g5 was played by Pedersen. And bishop takes g5. Bishop takes g5. Knight f6 was Rojan's reply, sacrificing a piece to keep the white king in the middle. Okay, it's a correspondence game. White took the piece, f takes g4. And then came expansion, d3. Now this is the type of thing you've always got to keep a lookout for in the Albin counter gambit. If you can trap the white king in the centre, especially in a position where you've castled long and already got your rook opposite the white queen, then you can look forward to pressure, and maybe even a quick win, as happened here. Pedersen played queen b3. I think he's trying to bail out by castling on the queen side himself. Rojan doesn't give him any time. He played knight e4. Very interesting move. Okay, the bishop can capture on d8. But, after that, I think that d2 is difficult for white to meet. So, white castle on the queen side, bailing out. But it's amazing in the Albin how the knights hop around quite often. Now, the knight came into d4. White's queen went to a4. b5, another pretty amazing move. Queen went to b4, and then black played c5. and white's queen went back to e1. So we're getting value for their money here in this game. Queen takes c4 check, king b1, queen c2 check, king a1, knight b3 check, king a2, and then d2. It's quite amusing. White didn't bother to waste a stamp. I don't think you want to see that position very often with white. Back now to a3. f6, you'll recall, black was sacrificing a pawn. E takes f6. Queen takes f6. Perhaps black's most difficult move to meet is g3. I think that's quite a good idea by white, because he doesn't block the bishop on c1 with the knight on b1. I think g3 is probably the most natural move. But still black can work up some play. The first move is as before, bishop f5. That's a good square for the bishop. Bishop g2. And now black would like to castle on the queen side. But then I think bishop g5 is a crushing reply. Accordingly, Rojan, whose line this is, tried to popularise the move h6. And I think it leads to a reasonable position for black. For instance, in the game Lundholm-Rojan, Sweden versus Norway 1948, white castled. I mean, you can just see your opponents playing this way. Castles, and only now did he play knight bd2. Now the idea is to attack on the king side with g5, and white has to find a way to unravel his own queen side. For instance, if you go b4, then I think d3 is a good move, with the same threats as before, twin threats this time, to the rook on a1 and to e2, followed by the usual trick, bishop d3. So white's most natural move, b4, is prevented. And if he's got to go into contortions, for instance with rook a2, as happened in this game, Lundholm versus Rojan, then I believe black gets a good game. Now actually in this game, black played h5 and tried to really get on with it. But I believe a more measured response is knight g7 in this position, intending knight g6, with a slightly slower build-up than before. I'll give you one taste of how play might develop. White pushes on with b4. I mean, he's been preparing that move, so he should play it. Knight g6. b5. Now, knight c to e5. This was the move that knight g7 prepared. Knight takes e5, opening up the diagonal. Knight takes e5, and white tries to get on with it on the queen side with queen a4. Well, now I believe black can simply play king b8, and it's got good compensation for the pawn, because it's difficult for white to stop the automatic attack with h5 to h4. I can tell you, with black's centralised pieces and the strong pawn at d4, that not many players, and this ridiculous rook at a2 of course, not many players would relish defending white's position here. So I believe this idea of knight slowly coming round to g6 to establish a knight on e5 is the correct plan for black and gives him good compensation. Summarising, I believe black should meet a3 with f6, developing quick counterplay in the centre and on the king side. When white accepts this gambit, e takes f6, queen takes f6, then black uses to the full this pawn at d4. He follows up with bishop f5 and castles on the queen side, with the possible advance d4 to d3 always in mind. The nice thing about f6, of course, is that it's not mentioned in the Encyclopedia of Chess Openings, and that's a big bonus for you. What you see here is either new analysis or it's been completely forgotten. So even if your opponents know you play the Albin, and by some freak they know you play this line, they go to their theory books, they won't be able to find a single thing. We now move on to consider 5 knight bd2. An idea recommended by Graham Burgess in his loud and dangerous book, The Queen's Gambit for the Attacking Player, published by Batsford in 1995. But I don't believe this move is particularly dangerous at all. In short, I recommend the move Bishop F5. A move which is so unusual I can't find any games with it at all on my database, which has over 400,000 games on, and there's very, very little in ECO about this move. Now the first point is that it sets a rather nasty trap. For instance, if white is silly enough to play just naturally on autopilot G3, then knight B4 almost wins on the spot. To be fair, Burgess does mention this particular trap. But let's continue the analysis of this position for a little while, just to show you how bad white's position really is. White may try Queen A4 check, which occurred in the game Kogan versus Shevadzadze, Azerbaijan, 1963, when black should have replied C6. This is the simplest idea, and the threat of knight C2 check is virtually impossible to stop. For instance, if knight H4 here, trying some cheapo on the bishop, then I think simply Queen D7. And black has an excellent game. So G3 is no good after Bishop F5. We can dismiss it. Accordingly, after Bishop F5, white has got to find a less stereotyped response. And there are two moves which might give black some bother. The first move, and I guess you could call it obvious if you like, is A3, which looks like a bit like the A3 variation. This time it's a necessary evil, because as you've seen, black is threatening knight B4. White must stop that threat. And now there are two good moves for black. The first move worth considering is a simple Queen D7, just backing up the bishop, preparing to castle long. And we're going to follow the game Teschner versus Wolf, Berlin 1939, where white played G3 here. Now black played knight G E7. White played knight B3, ganging up on the pawn at D4, and black castled on the queen side. Now probably best for white in this position is bishop G2, after which knight G6 gives black a reasonable game. But in Teschner Wolf, white became attracted by some bizarre tactics, which didn't really work out very well for him. He played knight C5, Queen E8, Queen A4. The idea being Queen B5 with some sort of mating attack. But black's position is tough enough to withstand this attack. Wolf played the obvious move, knight G6, letting the bishop out, attacking the knight on C5, attacking that pawn on E5, and this is the good move. Queen B5 didn't phase back at all. Bishop takes knight, queen takes C5, and then knight C takes E5. Well, by simple play, knight takes E5, knight takes E5. By simple play, black has exposed white's plan as premature. White would like to play bishop G2 here, but then knight D3, check, is the end of the game. So, faced with the threat of knight D3, white has to play a very, very uncomfortable move in this position. And Teschner played king D2 here. I know that looks absolutely dreadful. I mean, you'd much rather play, if you had to move your king, king D1. But in either case, the response is going to be the same. At some stage, black is going to break the position open with D3, and white's king is going to be very exposed wherever it goes. So, in this position, actually, after king D2, black could play D3 straight away, but he preferred queen E6, just securing the position of his bishop, just protecting his bishop, and also hitting the pawn at C4. White played the miserable B3, and now comes D3, with great effect. Well, white must keep lines closed, but E3 is not really a long-term solution. Knight F3 check, king D1, and Teschner played D2. Bishop went to B2, only move, and now queen E4. Absolutely horrible move to have to meet. Queen C2 check is a threat. There appears to be a veiled threat against the rook on H1. One move remains in this game. King E2 was played, And then a very nice move to finish. Seems to be a recurring theme in the Albin that black's knight's getting on the act. Knight G1 check. Amazing move. White resigned because of rook takes G1. Bishop G4 check. A very nice finish. Back now to the position after 6A3. Incidentally, in Burgess's book he just gives 6A3 interesting, recommended by ECO, nothing more. After A3, Queen D7 is a reasonable reply, but let's have a look at F6, the same idea that Rojan had after the immediate A3, 5A3, before knight BD2. If it was good while the white knight was on B1, well, it might be even better here, now that the knight on D2 is blocking white's bishop, so let's give it a try here. For instance, E takes F6, Queen takes F6. And we're now going to follow analysis by Francis Mindson, a French international master, in his book Le Gambit Albin. He gives B4 here as the best move for white. And then he thinks that castling on the queen side is the best move for black, whereupon knight B3 is apparently the best move for white here. Retracting that move, he just gives two alternatives. If Queen A4 here, then black should play quietly with King B8 with an unclear position. And just pulling back that move. If B5 instead of knight B3, then he gives knight E5, knight takes E5, Queen takes E5, knight F3, Queen E4. Black has perfectly adequate compensation for the Gambit pawn. A simple continuation, a simple way to develop black's pieces might be bishop C5, knight F6, rook H E8, with nice easy play. So knight B3, H6. You'll remember that was a common idea in the 5A3 variation. White was threatening bishop G5. Black stops it. B5. He gives knight E5. And now two lines, both leading to good play for black. In the first line, white captures on D4 immediately. Knight F takes D4. Bishop G4. F3. Bishop C5. With a very unclear position. The idea of bishop C5 is that if knight takes C5, then black has the rejoinder rook takes D4, with considerable counterplay in the centre. The idea being, of course, that if queen takes D4, knight takes F3 check, wins the white queen. So instead of knight F takes D4, bishop B2, knight takes F3 check, G takes F3, Queen G6. This is a strong move, I think, quite a common idea in this particular line, threatening bishop C2, winning a piece. So knight takes D4, and then he gives bishop C5 with full compensation for 2 pawns. There's a pin on the knight here, a very nasty pin, and black's development proceeds unhindered after, for instance, knight F6, and this time maybe black can take time out just to double up on the knight. Or, for instance, if white plays E3, then a move like rook H8 comes into consideration. In every case, white has problems with his king. Where is that king going to live? If it lives in the centre, it could well get fried to a crisp. A final move worth consideration after bishop F5, and Mindstone thinks this is the main line, is knight B3. No quarter given by white here, he's going straight after the pawn. But Mindstone gives now the interesting move F6. Gambiting. White plays E takes F6. Now just taking that move back, if knight B takes D4 in this position, then the idea is that black plays a check on B4 bishop b4 check. This is the main idea. And now, bishop d2, knight takes d4, threatening a check at c2, knight takes d4 by white, queen takes d4, bishop takes b4, queen takes b2, so bishop d2, and then just simply queen takes e5. Here black's regained everything he gave away, and he has the better pawn structure as well as a development advantage. So back now to the position after f6, and we see white chopping off the gambit pawn. So e takes f6, and as before, queen takes f6, preparing to castle long is the right reply. Now this is a very trappy line because white's always got to be on guard for this bishop b4 check move. For instance, if he now plays knight b takes d4, then comes bishop b4 check with the usual threats. Bishop d2, knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, I think you can probably see what's coming here, bishop takes b4, queen takes b2, bishop d2, and this time black castles on the queen side with a very good game. White shouldn't do this. So strong then is the threat of bishop b4 check that Mindzone gives a3 as the main line here. In fact, this is a very uncharted position. Again, no games on the database, no nothing. You're just on your own here. So it's all his analysis. And black should play h6. Once again, a key move in the system preventing bishop g5, preparing to castle on the queen side. And it's quite a potent move. For instance, if white plays g3 now, castles on the queen side, bishop g2, g5, with the usual black attack. For instance, if white now castles, then d3 I think is quite a good move here. At least very difficult to meet. And similar to the stuff we've been looking at earlier. All of white's moves have been geared up to taking the pawn on d4, so let's see what happens if he takes this pawn. So knight f takes d4. Castles on the queen side. So black is actually 2 pawns down, 2 clear pawns down in this position. But good development, a pin at the knight on d4, slightly awkward to meet. e3 would appear to be the best move. And now knight takes d4. Well, this forces white's hand. Of course, if he plays knight takes d4, question mark, then c5 wins everything back with interest. So he can't do that. Therefore, e takes d4 is the move. And white hopes to buy just enough time to play bishop e3. Well, black must not give him that time. And accordingly, if black didn't have a good move in this position, of course, he'd be bust, because bishop e3 would just consolidate. But he does have a good move, and that move is queen g6. This move, I think, more than keeps black on the board, because it sets up the killer threat of bishop c2. With the following analysis. If white plays queen f3 in this position, then bishop c2 is a strong move, threatening perhaps to take the knight on b3 and to then capture the pawn at d4. For instance, if white were to try and protect his position by playing d5, then rook e8 check, I think, is a good move. And then, after bishop e3, the knight at b3 hangs. So bishop e2, bishop takes b3, queen takes b3, queen takes g2, another point of the queen being on g6, rook f1, and then I think the most simple move is queen takes h2 here, with a good position for black. Again, white's king is a bit stuck, and black's pieces can stream out. For instance, knight f6, and then bishop to d6 or bishop to c5, and Harry the H pawn is waiting in the wings to win the game. A couple more lines illustrate white's plight in this position. If, for instance, bishop e3, very bad move, then just bishop c2 wins the game. Or, if d5, then Mindstone actually gives c6 in this position. But I don't see what's wrong with going bishop c2. And if queen f3, then rook e8 check, along the lines of the previous variation. That seems to be the perfect response for black. So all things considered, Mindstone thinks that black has more than adequate compensation for 2 pawns after queen g6. Summarising, after knight bd2, quite a common idea for white in the Albin counter gambit, I recommend bishop f5. Not only setting up the trap of knight b4, but also threatening coherent development, either with queen d7 and castles on the queen side, or quite often a gambit with f6, when after e takes f6, queen takes f6, black's pieces stream out to the attack. The final fifth white move to be considered, and perhaps the most popular at all levels of chess when the Albin is played, is the move 5g3. White retains maximum flexibility for the queenside pieces, the knight on b1, the bishop on c1, and just prepares bishop g2 and castles on the king side. I'm going to recommend the move bishop f5 to black, and this is the line which has received very few practical tests in any level of chess. There are very few games on the database with it, and I don't think your opponent will be particularly familiar with the ideas evolving from bishop f5. To start off with, is black actually threatening knight b4 in this position? That's a question white has to address straight away. Accordingly, I think 2 moves are suitable for white in this position. The first move is bishop g2, and perhaps that's the most natural move. The second move I'll consider is a3. Let's look at bishop g2 first. After that, I recommend queen d7, backing up the bishop. And we'll now follow the game Juan Belon Lopez, a grandmaster from Spain, against an IM from Italy, Federico Chiribisi. And this was played in an Italian Open, Genoa, 1981. A very quick win by black from this position. White castled after queen d7, and black played the immediate bishop h3. Now normally black would castle in this position, but Chiribisi's idea is to attack on the king side straight away with bishop h3 and h5, h4, possibly before even castling on the queen side, so as not to give white a target. For instance, if the black king goes to the queen side, perhaps white can try to attack this king. If black delays castling for a while and goes straight onto the attack, he's hoping to gain time by this idea. Well, Belon didn't really know what to do against this. He went a3, just some vague idea of counter-attacking on the queen side, and black went straight for it with h5. b4 happened, and black took on g2. King takes, and only now castles on the queen side. White pushed on the queen side, b5, and black went into a kind of huddle with knight c e7. Now this might look bad for black, but actually what progress is white making over on the queen side? If he plays queen a4, black defends securely with the simple move king b8. Otherwise, I think if white plays bishop b2, then knight f5 is an interesting move. And these pawns on b5 and c4 don't look too great to me. For instance, can a black bishop slip into c5? If black achieves this position, not only is his queen side secure, but h4 is certainly on the cards. So black is methodically building up here. After knight c7, the grandmaster tried to put paid to black's attack with h4. And I think this is going to be quite a common reaction in your games. People are going to try and stop your attack with h4. And Chiribisi played knight g6. Then came queen d3. And then knight h6. That's an interesting move. We'll see the main reason for that a little later on. White played e3. And now came queen to g4. E takes d4. And now the reason for putting the knight on h6, knight coming in to f5. And now you can see the pressure starting to build on the white king. Bellon tried bishop g5, which black was happy to block with bishop e7. And white played queen d2. But unfortunately, after bishop takes g5, white doesn't really have a comfortable recapture, because what he'd like to do, of course, is to recapture with the queen. But I think after queen takes g5, then knight g takes h4 check, surprisingly, is curtains for white. He can't take with the queen, obviously. If he takes with the knight, he leaves his own queen on pre, otherwise he can't take with the pawn, so this move just wins for black. So after bishop takes g5, white had to play knight takes g5, but then rook takes d4. So you can see the way that black's played the attack is very, very accurate. He's managed to get his own pressure, he's managed to make his own pressure tell before white got going on the queen side. It's not surprising the game finished very abruptly after this. White played queen c1, black played knight g takes h4 check, white played king h1 and simultaneously resigned. Now it's not often you see a grandmaster go down with white in 20 moves like that against a so-called lesser player. I think it was the opening that was to blame. So after bishop g2, it seems that the queen d7 plan, followed by bishop h3 and h5, is quite interesting and certainly very playable for black. Now we move on to 6a3, which looks quite logical, stopping knight b4 and at the same time preparing to expand on the queen side. And I'm going to give you two ideas against this move. Now the first slightly unusual idea is an idea of Nigel Povar, my Guildford clubmate. And he recommends just playing a5 in this position, slightly different handling of the position by black. And his idea is that after bishop g2, he wants to play bishop c5 here. Just play with his pieces. For instance, if white castles in this position, then queen d7. And black has the same idea of bishop h3, but he's playing the position more fluidly, restraining white on the queen side, and at the same time planning knight e7, knight g6. This time I think black has to castle short. The game Botterill Povar, London, 1980 continued from this position. b4. Well, this is not a desperate move by white, but a move that recognises that black has considerable play in this position. White is actually sacrificing a pawn to try to slow black down. He can see what's coming up. A takes b4, bishop b2, b takes a3, knight takes a3, knight g e7, which led to a perfectly satisfactory position for black. That's an interesting treatment. I mean, black can adopt this treatment against most ideas by white. Back at the ranch now with a3, and if you don't like that treatment after a5, we now follow a game of Federico Chirubisi's, yet another game, and this time he's playing black against the Austrian master Gigel. After a3, black played queen d7, and then came knight bd2, whereupon Chirubisi decided to sacrifice with f6. He takes f6, knight takes f6. So this is a little bit different to the Gambit we're used to, but he looks no less dangerous. White's plays rather slow here. Bishop g2 was played, and Chirubisi played bishop h3. That's the same idea that he used against Bellon. White castled, and now comes h5. So again, black's getting on with the attack on the king side before castling on the queen side. Rook e1. And now bishop takes g2. Never miss the opportunity to swap that off. King takes g2, and black gets on with it. h4. Well, white saw the attack coming and he decided not to take the further pawn. For instance, if he goes knight takes h4 in this position, then g5 is at the very least an extremely dangerous attack. I mean, you can understand why white wouldn't want to do that. So he decided to try to desperately get some counterplay before the roof caved in on the king's side. But black correctly bottled things up with d3, and now white's position just gets more and more difficult. Knight takes h4 probably decided his position was so bad he had to take the pawn and try and hang on. But g5, knight hf3, black hasn't lost time castling long, the crucial point to remember. Queen h3 check, king g1, and then g4 happened. Well, only one move now, knight h4 to block the file. Now came knight e5, so white's really bottled up here. He's 2 pawns up, but his pieces lack any space, any breathing space whatsoever. The following move is really desperate already. He played f4, but now rook takes h4, an excellent move. G takes h4, knight f3 check, actually this is a very nice finish. Knight takes f3, G takes f3, queen d2, only move, and then knight e4. That's a lovely finish actually. White is completely paralysed, and black never did get round to castling long. So a lovely game that by black, very consistent indeed. Summarising, against 5g3, I recommend the relatively uncharted move, bishop f5. And then if a3, we have 2 methods of deployment. Either you can play the traditional queen d7, with the possible gambit f6 in mind, with castles long in mind. Or you can play this unusual setup of Povar, just playing around the pawn on d4 with the pieces. a5, bishop coming out to c5, queen up to d7, knight e7, with the ideas knight g6, maybe castle short, rook e8 in mind. This sort of piece deployment, that's a very interesting way of playing for black. And against bishop g2, study Cherubisi's games carefully. In particular, the line where he played queen d7, got a very early bishop h3 in, and then played h5 before castling on the queen side, making it less easy for white to find a target for his own counter-attack. Bear these ideas in mind, and I think you'll have a successful and enjoyable time against this mainline move 5g3. I'll go on now to look at the Spassky variation of the Albin counter gambit, which occurs after the capture on e5. Black plays d4, pushing this wedge into white's position. And now, not knight f3, but e4. Now this is a slightly unusual looking move, because it already gives black a strong protected passed pawn. But Boris Spassky, who devised this move, was intending to play around black's pawn. And in particular, he hoped to set up the attacking formation, bishop on d3, pawn up to f4, knight f3, and castles on the king's side. After which white has some hope of a king's side attack. Now against this plan, f6, a very violent gambit move. And the justification of this move is that white takes quite a bit of time to set up his attacking formation. Black will use that time, giving up a pawn, to accelerate development as quickly as possible. And we're going to follow the game Stefan Djuric, who is a grandmaster, versus Joksic for Nyaka Banya 1978, where black destroyed white with active play from this position. This is a gambit white has to accept. Djuric played e takes f6, and black played knight takes f6, with the initiative against the e4 pawn. No matter, bishop d3 was played. That seems to be all part of white's scheme. And then came knight c6. So perhaps knight e5 is a move very much on black's menu. Now there are two moves for white. In the game Juric-Joksic, white played knight e2, and we'll look at that first. Black played bishop b4 check. It's very important this move is check, as that gains an attacking tempo. So bishop d2 was played. Black castled, speeding up development. White castled too. Now came the point of black's play, a very interesting attacking move. Black played knight g4. Now already you can see the merits of that move. Black introduces play along the f file for the rook on f8. He's planning maybe queen h4, putting pressure on h2 and f2. And if white manages to find a defence against both of those threats, then the knight can swing round to the very strong square e5. All in all, knight g4 is a very strong move. Juric tried to eject that knight straight away, but unfortunately the move h3 gives him additional weaknesses on the king side to defend, and this makes white's position really difficult. Knight ge5 was played, and now already white's got some problems with his bishop. For instance, now if bishop c1, undeveloping, but how do you protect this bishop? Then bishop takes h3 is an absolute crusher here, because if g takes h3, then knight f3 check, king g2, queen h4 gives black a winning attack. White has no really adequate defence to the entry of one of black's rooks, either via f6 to g6 or rook e8, e6 and then swinging across to g6. White's king is completely naked. It's all over. So, Grandmaster Juric played bishop f4. But again, Joksic played the amazing move bishop takes h3. And now what does white do? I mean, he can barely refuse the sacrifice. If he refuses the sacrifice, he's just lost an important pawn covering his king for absolutely nothing. Black has gained back the material he sacrificed, and he's still got a vicious attack. Meanwhile, this bishop on d3 looks like a pawn, doesn't it? A sophisticated pawn. So this is a sacrifice again white has to accept. G takes h3 was played, and black brought his queen out. Queen h4. Juric came up with this miserable move, but maybe the only move. Bishop g3. Queen takes h3 was played, and then f4. Trying to hang on. Not surprisingly, black played knight g4, and then rook f2 was played by Juric, trying to break the attack by giving back a bit of material. And then came knight c to e5, another excellent attacking move. Well, white's lost here. Queen f1 was played, desperately trying to rush the queen across to the defence of the king. Then knight takes f2, nicely defending the queen on h3. Queen captured on f2, but unfortunately that poor old bishop is loose, so knight takes d3. Actually, black is now material ahead. Well, that was pretty unpleasant after white played the natural move knight e2. So we'll see what happens if white goes on with the Spassky plan, playing f4 in this position. Now I recommend the move bishop b4 check, continuing momentum, with two lines. In the first line, white plays bishop d2, as did Juric before, but then castles e5, knight g4 gives black an excellent game, due to the threat of knight e3, which is actually not so easy for white to stop. In the other line, after the bishop check, white plays knight d2. But black's idea is the same. He tries to get the knight into e3 as quickly as possible. So I recommend knight g4 straight away. Well, as white can't stop the knight coming in, he may as well try and boot black's pieces around. So a3 has emerged at the main line. But in the game Osipov versus Zuravlev, Latvian Championship 1972. Black quickly obtained a winning advantage. First of all, the knight went in to e3. Now that completely forces white's move. Queen's got to come out to defend g2. So the queen went to e2. And black played bishop g4. Perhaps this is the reason he didn't put his queen on f3 in the first place, because he wanted to play knight f3 in this position. And now black kept the pot boiling with bishop takes f3, not giving white any time at all to rest. Queen takes f3, castles on the king's side, exclamation mark. Well, white would have liked to take the piece, but can you see what would happen next? I think you can. If a takes b, which white didn't play, then rook takes f4. Here's an absolute crusher. For instance, queen e2, knight takes b4, simply. And black has a multitude of threats. Naturally, white can't take this rook. If queen takes f4, then knight takes g2 check. It's a terrible fork. So white was forced to leave this bishop on the board, contenting himself with the miserable move g3. But then came knight e5. This seems to crop up all the time in the Spassky line. Queen e2, only move. And rook takes f4. Again, double exclamation mark this time, I think, because that was the move white was trying so desperately hard to stop. Now, of course, if g takes f4, then queen h4 check is an absolute wipeout. Queen f2, knight takes d3, gulp. So in the game, a takes b4 was played, but black was really working up a head of steam here, and he played queen f6, just ignoring the fact that the rook was on pre. And really this game is very amusing. White played rook f1 to try to nullify black's threat. I mean, putting that rook back, black was actually threatening to go rook f2 here, with the usual fork on d3 coming up should white capture that rook. So white played rook f1, not very happy to do so. And then rook takes f1 check, knight takes f1, and again both of black's knights appeared on the 6th rank. Knight f3 check is an amazing position, this really is. King went to f2, only move, and then knight takes h2 check, king e1, and knight h takes f1. Secured a winning position for black. It's easy to forget actually in this position that black is a pawn up as well as having a crushing attack. Anybody can see that black is winning hands down. Summarising, I don't think you're going to meet Spassky's move 4e4 very often. It's rather an antiquated way to handle the position. And when you do, rather than knight c6, I think f6 is the correct response. Speeding up black's development, attacking white's position before he can get this attacking formation that he's trying to set up underway. f6 is the complete response to 4e4. Obviously, if white wants anything special from this opening, then he must accept the gambit. But there are many cowardly players who will not accept the gambit, and you need to know what to do if they don't. A plausible move, not a bad move, but it doesn't achieve anything for white, is e3. That's just a careful move. But I believe black gets good play against this move by transposing to the exchange variation of the French defence. The first move, key move, is e takes d4. White would play e takes d4. And then knight comes out to f6. White plays knight c3. And now I recommend the move bishop e7. Now actually we have transposed back into the French defence where a variation where white plays an early c4, a very uncommon line. And I think black can achieve satisfactory play. I present a recent game, Mises versus Bagirov, Latvia 1991, to show model play by black. Mises continued with knight f3. I think that's a decent enough move. But black's development proceeds unhindered with castles on the king side. Now white played bishop d3. In several games, white has played bishop e2 recently, but I'm going to show you a plan for black which works against either of these moves, in that after bishop d3, black immediately captured on c4. Bishop took on c4, and now Bagarov played a good positional move, bishop g4, pinning the knight on f3. Well, this already creates a threat of bishop takes f3, which is a little bit awkward for white in view of the weakness of the pawn at d4. So Mises elected to put his bishop from c1 to e3, which is perhaps not the most aggressive square for the bishop. He's just shoring up his central pawn. I guess the bishop on g5 will be a lot more aggressive, but at the moment I don't think that move's very practical. So he preferred bishop e3. Black's development cracked on with knight c6, and white castled on the king side. And once again Bagarov played a very natural move, queen to d6, preparing perhaps to bring his rooks to the middle of the board. In particular, rook a d8 looks like a good follow-up to this queen move, again putting pressure on white's isolated pawn. Well, Mises played bishop back to e2 at this point, and black played knight b4. So another good positional move by black. He could have equally brought his rook over to d8, but knight b4, preparing to come to d5, securing the square in front of the isolated pawn, blockading the isolated pawn, hoping to win it later. And white replied knight e5. Bishop captured on e2. Incidentally, I think it's the presence of this isolated pawn that gives black such a comfortable game here. It's difficult for white to build up any attack in this position to offset the weakness of the isolated pawn, and this is what gives black such a comfortable game. Queen takes e2 by white. Could have captured with the knight, but that would have led to nothing either. And black just brought his knight back to d5. So the reason I'm recommending black's system to you is that it's very easy to play. I mean, basically black has just developed his pieces in very sensible fashion, and now he blockades the isolated pawn. It's very simple to play this type of position. White played rook a d1, and black just reinforced his knight with c6, so nice easy moves. Probably this position, if not slightly better for black, is certainly very okay for black. I mean, black is at least equal. Summarising, I think the move 3e3 is not a bad move at all. It's quiet and, to be honest, doesn't really pose too much of a problem to the Albin. But black has to be careful where he puts his pieces. I recommend pawn takes pawn, e takes d4, knight f6 as the complete antidote, with the easy follow-up knight c3, bishop e7, knight f3, castles, and black has a very comfortable game. Another alternative for white at move 3 is the quiet move knight c3. Now, not many players are going to try this against you, but you should know how to refute this move if they do. The simplest way to get a good position is to play e takes d4 here, luring white's queen into the middle of the board, with the follow-up. Queen takes d4, and now knight c6 is an excellent move. Gambiting the d-pawn, queen takes d5, and then bishop e6 I think is a very strong move, with two lines. In the first line, white takes the queen on d8, queen takes d8 check. But after rook takes d8, black's lead in development is very difficult for white to meet. Black has two threats here. The first and most obvious threat is to the pawn on c4 with a bishop. But if white plays the natural move to defend this pawn, for instance e3, then knight b4 is a crusher. So actually this line of trading the queens is completely unpromising for white. Accordingly, in the game Karu versus Kiris, Estonia, 1931, a very old reference because nobody plays this line at all these days, white went queen b5. But you can't help getting the impression that something's gone wrong already, when for a lousy pawn, white has to start making these very unnatural moves. And it's no surprise that by continuing to kick the queen around, black gets a terrific initiative. Kyrgyz played a6, very strong move. The idea being that if queen takes b7, well, knight b4 or knight d4 are both absolutely devastating moves. So white can't take that pawn. Therefore queen a4 was played. And now comes bishop b4. Well, very difficult move to meet this. Pins the knight and renews the threat of bishop takes c4. And in the game Kuru versus Kyrgyz, white decided to bail out, if you like, with bishop d2. Then came bishop takes c4, a3, b5, queen came back to c2, black brought his knight into d4, there's only one move now, queen e4 check, and then came bishop e7, after which black has a tremendous position, and he went on to win in 25 moves. Who says censorship should be tightened up? If the bores of the chess world have their way, we'd all be playing the Rai Lopez. To hell with all this World Championship rubbish. When I'm drawing my pension, I'll let you know about the Catalan. No, if I can give away my e-pawn at move 2, I'm a happy man.